Thank you for joining me. This is going to be a tutorial about gauge. I'm hoping I could get completely through it this time without without getting interrupted. This is my third try. Okay, here we go. So I wanted to discuss a yarn label gauge versus pattern gauges and how to learn what your gauge is when you're making a swatch. So here we see a yarn label. You'll see the 4, which is medium. That's talking about the weight of the yarn, the thickness of it, and it's also known as worsted. Just so if you see worsted weight, it's medium. Okay, now I want to look at this middle square here. This middle square has needles, and the right-hand square has a hook. So if you're knitting, you're looking at that middle square. If you're crocheting, you look at that right-hand square. You'll notice both of them on the left-hand side say 4 inches by 4 inches and 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters on top. Both of them are the same. That's pretty industry standard, and you'll see that on most yarn labels. Now, we'll look at the other numbers. I'll take knitting first. You'll see that it says 16S, which is stitches, by 22R, which is rows. So, if you were to cast on 16 stitches and knit 22 rows, you should have a 4-inch square, and that would also be a 10 centimeter square. In crochet, this is 12 SC, which is single crochet, and 14 rows. So if you're to cast on 13 and do 12 single crochets and continue along, flipping back and forth until you have 14 rows, it would be a 4-inch square. So that is basically a pretty standard way to write out gauge. You'll see it on yarn labels commonly, and it just gives you an idea of how big or small the stitches are, and it makes that suggestion of needle size. With the hook, it was a size L or 8 millimeter in order to get the 12 stitches in the 14 rows to 4 inches. With knitting, it was a US size 10 or 6 millimeter needle, and it was 16 stitches and 22 rows. So if you followed those directions and knit or crocheted a swatch to those specifications, then you would have your 4-inch square. I really wanted to bring this to your attention first because this is what the yarn makers decided their average swatch would be, their average gauge. So they would knit or crochet, and they would measure the amount of stitches for the 4 inches and measure the amount of rows for the 4 inches, and they think this is pretty standard. When you actually read a pattern, it has nothing to do with the yarn label. I wanted to make that very important. And before we get into you finding out how to measure your own stitches, I wanted to show you the difference in sizes of my knitted pieces here. These are some swatches I did, just to have as an example. Now when I back away from it, do you see the difference in the size? The left swatch is tighter, and the right swatch is looser. There's the same amount of stitches on both. There's the same amount of rows on both. I did not add any rows to the right-hand side. I knit tighter with my left hand than I do with my right hand. Now, keeping this in mind, I wanted to explain pattern gauge with you because I have been told by many knitters I don't have to make a gauge. I always knit on gauge. I don't have to knit the swatch and measure. Now, this is primarily why I went ahead and I made up these 2 swatches. I really wanted you to see the difference that a person can have from knitter to knitter. So different pattern makers will have different tensions. Everybody's tension will be a little bit different. My left-handed tension is a lot tighter than my right-handed knitting, and I'm the same person. So what I wanted you to understand is when someone's writing a pattern, they're doing it off of their tension. So they would knit either a swatch or their project, and they would measure out the stitches. They'd get an accurate gauge, and they'd do all the calculations for the different sizes based off of their stitches. It's not based off of the yarn label they bought the yarn with, but the needles they knit the project with and their own tension. So keep in mind that every designer doesn't have the same tension. So it's really can be a very big mistake not to knit a swatch, especially if you are doing clothing items. It can make a big difference in hats. Sometimes it won't. It depends on your needle size. But I figured I'd go ahead and go off of our yarn label here. Where did I put it? Here it is. So I also wanted to go ahead and show you how to count some stitches and how to count some rows. I'll show you on stockinette and garter. Garter stitch was knitting every single row, and this is what it looks like. It's actually not too hard to count the rows here. Each ridge will be 2 rows. So I'll take my thumb and I'm going to go ahead and flip it over to the front here. And see this little tiny, let's see, I'll move it right here. This yellow ridge I'll count as the first 2 rows. So I go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. You get the picture. So each one of these little ridges going across would be 2 rows. I'm going to see if I can actually get closer to show you the stitches. It's a little bit harder, but see the little bumps that are like a upside down smiley face, maybe more of the frown. You'll see that one little part comes down into a smile, and then connected it goes more into a frown shape. When I count stitches in garter stitch, I count those little frown parts. So let's see if I can find one where the colors are very different. See how there's one on the left here who's a little bit greener, this one's bluer. This is where I'm going to start. So that little bump would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I'm counting those little itty bitty frown looking spaces that go across the top. So that's how I would count those stitches. I'll show you stockinette, which is knit a row, purl a row. Let's see if we can get, there we go, now we're in better focus. And when you count rows here, I'm going to start counting from this little yellow guy right here. There's a little V, and I start with a V, and I'm going to go up to, I'm going to end with the top yellow where it starts looking purple, and I'll count up the rows so you can see what I mean. But here we go. I'll start with that yellow one again. So it's the little V. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So below the purple, there are 7 rows of stitches there. So I'm going to try to hold it up so you can look and see if you're able to count on your own those 7 rows. And then when you go sideways, you could count the stitches. I'm trying to see if I can find a real clear color change so it's easier to count. I'll start with this pale green one here. So here is 1 stitch, it's a little V, 2 stitches, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I counted 9 stitches between my 2 thumbs now. And you could also look at them in length where they look like braids. just kind of going up and down. I wanted to give you a chance to go ahead and look at that. Those are how we count them. So, just to make it easier, so we could stick with the yarn label, it's not the size of this, but say we had 16 stitches across. What you would do is take a calculator and you would do 16 divided by 4, which gives you 4. So it would be 4 stitches per inch. And then rows, 22 divided by 4 is 5.5. So it's 5.5 rows per inch. And I like looking at them per inch. If you're doing a particular pattern, you can go ahead and do your full swatch, what they suggest, and see if it measures right, and then if it is, you're good to go. But I wanted to show you how to calculate out gauge per inch rather than going by just the 4-inch square in case you're trying to make your own pattern like a scarf. Scarves are very simple. You could do the same thing with a blanket. It's a big flat piece. So let's say that when I was knitting, every row I had what the yarn label has with the 16 stitches and the 5.5 rows per inch. Now, let's say I want to make a scarf, and I like 6-inch scarves. So what you would do is you would go 6 times 4, since you had 4 stitches per inch, and that is 24. So if you're wanting a 6-inch wide scarf, and your knitting is 4 stitches per inch, then you would cast on 24 stitches, because 4 times 6 is 24. And the 6 was for how wide you wanted the scarf. So you wanted 6 inches wide, and you know 4 stitches is how many stitches you got per inch. That's why we do 4 times 6. Now, if you're doing a scarf, usually they're about 5 feet long. Some are a little longer, some are a little less. Scarves, you can go pretty much to how long you wanted, but you can figure out exactly how many rows would be in your scarf if you wanted to really be exact. So let's look at this. So if we have a 5-foot long scarf, that's 60 inches and 5 feet. So we take 60 and we times it by 5.5 because there was 5.5 rows per inch. That is 330. So that would tell you that if you cast on 24 stitches and did 330 rows, you would have a scarf that is 6 inches wide and 60 inches long. So that's just basically how someone writing a pattern would do their math. They would figure out exactly how many stitches they had per inch and how many rows they had per inch, and then they would start converting the numbers to the design they wanted. It works the same with sweaters, jackets, hats. We all have to do these measurements if we're starting to design clothing, scarves, blankets, but I wanted you to know at least how to get your gauge, how to understand it, why it's important, and why I really try to convince people to make swatches if it's something that is a garment like that you would wear. For instance, with crochet, I never bothered with the swatches because I knitted primarily Afghans. They lay flat, they don't have to form around your body. And if it was a little bigger or a little smaller, I really didn't care. That was when I first started crocheting. I learned off of Afghans and was lazy about doing the swatches. but if you're doing clothing, it becomes much, much more important. I just wanted to let you know that patterns aren't written off of a generalized industry standard, but actually the standard of the person who knit the garment in the first place and created the pattern. Now, if I wrote my patterns with my left-handed knitting as a gauge, and I know it's much tighter than my right-handed knitting, you could see how a lot of people might start knitting a hat project that I wrote left-handed, and they're like, hey, wait, my project's coming out much bigger. Well, then they knit bigger than what I knitted and use the pattern for. It's just something to be aware of, and thank you for watching. I hope that this helped kind of clear up some of the information about gauges that you may have, and I'll talk to you soon.